Ugh. Ugh. It's Quandry Day. What's Quandry Day? Quilting, laundry, quandary. Yep, that means it's time to sort some scrap fabrics. Can you see me? No matter what kind of creator you are, a woodworker, paper crafter, quilter, you're going to have scraps, and managing them can be daunting. If you aren't careful, that mountain of leftovers turns into a volcano, erupting and spewing scraps all over your workspace. If that describes your stash, you're in the right place. Hello Treasure Hearties, I'm Eric, your Treasure Heart creator, and in this video I'm sharing my best tips for creating a system to organize, use, and finally control your scraps. Years ago, managing my scrap stash was more or less me kind of copying some other creator, but no matter whose system or advice I followed, managing my stash felt like too much effort. And eventually I just give up and buy more fabric and make my colorful scrappy quilt. And then ended up creating more scraps. Managing scraps does take time and effort. If only there were an AI app that could actually pre-cut and sort your scraps. Honey, I'd be the first in line for that. Trust me, I would push everyone out of my way like a person at a Black Friday sale at Walmart. One day, I got fed up and I analyzed my scrap fabric workflow. I asked myself some key questions, and the answers gave me insights on how to create a better fabric scrap management system to control the growth of my scrap stash, use it in quilts, and get it out the door. Notice, I did say system. You see, managing your fabric scraps isn't just about sorting and organizing it. It's about understanding how scraps flow through your entire creative process. For myself, I built my system on 3 key factors. Number 1, how is it that I'm using my fabric scraps? Number 2, how am I sorting and organizing my scrap stash to facilitate that usage? And number 3, how am I creating fabric scraps in the first place? Let me walk you through these 3 factors, and perhaps you can reflect on your own scrap management system. Sometimes starting at the end and working your way backwards is the best way to look at a situation. This is why I started looking at how my scraps are making it into projects and quilts. So I made a list of all the projects and quilts where I used up my fabric scraps. And I was quite surprised to see the diversity of these projects. Of course, there's the scrappy quilts, but I make a handful of utilitarian projects such as bags, book covers, and I also use fabric scraps with various crafting projects. Now, focusing in on just my scrap quilts, I took note that I made different sizes of quilts and different sizes of quilt blocks. There really wasn't a standard size that I kept to, but I noticed that I would often use scrap fabrics based on the color and kind of experiment with different color combinations. Now, seeing the diversity of scrap quilts and crafting projects, I quickly realized that I was doing something wrong. You see, I would spend hours and hours pre-cutting fabric scraps to certain sizes. And what for? Well, it was based on the advice of a very well-known scrappy quilter who does a mystery quilt every year, starting in November and ending in January sometime. If you know, you know. I can count on 0 fingers how many times or how many of her mystery quilts I've completed. So it didn't make sense for me to keep pre-cutting the fabric based on this particular quilter system. Furthermore, I kind of realized that since I make blocks of various sizes and quilts of various sizes, well, the size fabric piece that I need really depends on what I'm making and the project I'm using it on. and I don't always know what quilt I feel like making next with my scrap stash. So it made more sense for me to do the least amount of pre-cutting and try to keep the fabric scrap as whole as possible. Now, that is not to say I don't pre-cut any fabric scraps. I do cut it down to certain sizes based upon my usage, and I'll go into this later in the video. Now, I mentioned that I had this realization about my use of fabrics based on color. I noticed that when I'm searching for fabrics, I usually have a certain color in mind, or I'm experimenting with a certain color variation. I seem to prioritize what color a fabric is more than what size that it is. So it would make sense for me to sort my fabric scraps by color or separate them into certain color categories. Prior to this realization, I was just sorting everything by pre-cut size, which, as I just explained, made no sense for me. So when creating your own system, think about how you use your fabrics, because I'll bet it will give you insights on how you should be organizing your scrap stash. Do you make bags? Or do you use fabrics in other crafting projects? Also give some consideration on the types of quilts you like to make, or the types of quilting techniques that you enjoy most. Are you an EPP person? If so, you probably should create a sizable hexie stash. Are you a foundation paper piecing quilter or an applique quilter? With paper piecing and applique work, you never really know what fabric size you need. So maybe it's not a good idea for you to pre-cut your fabrics. Or maybe you're the complete opposite and you love using those layer cakes. You love those charm packs and the jelly rolls. If so, wouldn't it make sense for you to pre-cut 5-inch squares, 10-inch squares, and 2.5-inch strips? The point is, you have to create a system that is tailored to you. And a huge part in creating an effective system is discovering how you use up the fabric scraps. It will give you hints as to how you should sort and organize your scrap stash to facilitate its usage. So after understanding how I am using my fabric scraps, well, I understood how important it is for me to organize it by color. Now, that's not to say that color is the only consideration. Well, it is the primary guide, but size also has a role in how I sort and organize my scraps as well. Here's how. So after a project is done, I usually empty the leftover fabrics or the scraps into this container here. And I'll leave it there until it's Quandry Day. I try to have a Quandry Day at least once a month, or whenever I just feel like fondling fabrics. Now, Quandry Day is just about sorting and organizing the scraps, but I may do some pre-cutting, but usually not much. First, I will take the leftover yardage and give it an eyeball measurement. Now, if it looks to be more than a yard, well, I'll wrap it around a foam board and store it as a mini bolt of fabric. If the fabric piece looks to be about a yard, I'll fold it up neatly. Now, if it is less than a yard, I usually will cut it up into fat quarters or some pre-cut size. All yardage and fat quarters are stored on the fabric shelf. So let's start sorting some scrap fabrics here, and hopefully by the end of this session, this whole pile of scraps is going to be sorted into one of these bins, or I will have an action plan as to what I'm going to do with it. When I am ready to start sorting my fabrics out, I will actually pull out each of these bins here. Now, these bins actually group the fabrics into color or color groups. So in this bin here, I have yellows, and I also have the browns or some of the neutral colors. This bin is all just white fabric, maybe off-white, a little bit of a khaki, but mostly white fabrics. This is my blue and green, and these are the purples here. And I do have one bin on the ground. I had to remove it It's not on the table here, but there is a bin for the reds and oranges. I'm not very picky about colors. What do I mean by that? I mean, I don't care if it's light blue, dark blue, navy blue, blue, sky blue. If it's blue, it's blue. It's going in one bin. I don't give any consideration if there's like this fabric here. Fortunately for me, it's a blue and green combination. It's going in the blue bin here. This one's kind of a darker maroon color. That's purple. I don't sit here and stress out over what color it is because, well, you can drive yourself crazy doing that. So that's purple. If it looks purple to me, that's where it's going. So this, although this is kind of a teal or aqua color, it's going in there. Now, once in a while, you do have fabrics that are prints like this, in which if you look at it closely, you can kind of see prints or hints of red and gray. But for me, if anything, I can do one of two things. If I'm really not sure what color or this really is, I can cut this down, because when you look at the whole fabric all together, it might seem like one color, but you know, when you cut it to an individual part, like just a square with just that, you know, I can see red right there. So there's going to be a separate pile where I'm going to cut it down like a 2.5 inch square in this case. These, sometimes I do throw these into that laundry or Quandry basket, I should say. If I'm doing instructional videos, I have to have the process of making something midway. So these are kind of orphan blocks, as I would call them. They're not fully completed, but then they've been started, but I didn't fully finish it. Most of the time with these, I will just kind of cut it up into pieces and just use it as a crumb piece. But sometimes like this, I could cut it down to a half square triangle. I'll put this in the crumb piece or crumb pile, but I might turn it into something later. Yeah, these squares I can definitely put into the pile of stuff that I need to pre-cut along with this. How do I handle fabrics like this where you got every single possible color of the rainbow in there? There is one more pile of fabric, or one more pile that I do have, and I call it the, to put it bluntly, I call it the what the hell pile. These are fabrics where I just really don't know what I want to do or what color to classify it in. And it's usually a multicolored thing like this where nobody can really decide what color it really is. Now, most of the time, if it's a fabric like this, I'm just going to put it in my pre-cut pile and I'll cut it down to smaller squares, because more than likely a fabric like this, that's how I'm going to use it. I'm just going to use a small square of it and throw this into a scrappy quilt because, well, the print is very scrappy in and of itself. Here's a good fabric to look at. This is actually a width of fabric, but it's a 1/2 yard cut. And if it's like this, I can keep it as a 1/2 yard, but in this case, I kind of think that looking at that, I would much more rather have it as a fat quarter. So I'm just going to cut this in half. And now I have 2 fat quarters that I can just kind of fold it to the side, or put it to the side, and we'll fold it up later. Let's talk pre-cuts for a moment. When I say pre-cuts, I don't specifically mean your charm packs or your layer cakes and jelly rolls. No. What I really mean is, what size do you cut your fabric scraps to for future use? Now, as I mentioned before, I used to pre-cut my fabric scraps into various sizes based on a suggestion from a well-known scrap quilter. I would cut 1.5-inch squares and strips, then 2-inch squares and strips, then 2.5, then 3, and yeah, you kind of get the idea. And that went all the way up to 10 inches. Now I stopped doing that because, well, I wasted my time cutting fabrics into sizes that I rarely used. But I did not totally abandon any pre-cut size. I still do 2.5-inch squares because I like to make 4-patch units with them. And I use it in quilt blocks. I do 2.5-inch strips for binding or sashing. And I have a small stack of 5-inch squares and strips if I just need a quick project. I also do have 1.5-inch squares that I turn into 4-patches or 9-patch units for future use. Now with these particular sizes, they are cut for a specific usage in mind. They're not cut in hopes that someday I might need them. Now, if you are someone that pre-cuts their fabric scraps, well, ask yourself this question. Are you cutting it with a specific usage in mind, or are you just cutting it for the sake of cutting it and storing it for that someday project? Now, pre-cutting your fabric also involves knowledge of quilting math. I will bet you there are many of you that, well, you don't know what size you should cut a fabric to in order to make a specific quilting unit. If that's you, I have the perfect series for that. How's that for a shameless plug? Now, there is a special category of scraps that most would recognize as strings or crumbs. Now, what constitutes a string or crumb will vary from quilter to quilter, and it usually revolves around size. For me, any strip of fabric that is less than 2.5 inches wide, but longer than 10 inches, I consider that a string. Now, if a scrap is a square, or it could be some odd shape that is less than 2.5 inches big, that's a crumb. Now, anyone who has followed this channel for a while knows that I like to do string blocks or crumb blocks. And I always look for different ways in using them in quilt blocks. In fact, there was a whole series of videos dedicated to strings and crumbs. Shameless plug number 2. Now, some quilters love working with strings and crumbs, while others hate sewing crumbs altogether. It's a matter of preference, so don't feel like you have to sew strings and crumbs just because I'm mentioning it here. I set strings and crumbs aside for a rainy day sewing, or whenever I want to sew something mindless. Sometimes I will use a string or a crumb as a leader and ender, and they do make it into blocks and quilts, which, after all, is the goal. Look, the bottom line here is, however you sort and organize your scraps should facilitate how you use them to create quilt units or quilt blocks. So if you like to pre-cut your scraps, well, look at what sizes that you use the most, because you don't have to pre-cut your scraps into every possible shape or size. Or if you're a quilter that shops by color, well, why not organize it by color? Hopefully, your self-discovery on how you use your scraps gave you insights on how you should organize your scraps. Now, it was kind of interesting for me to discover how exactly I create scraps. You see, the logic behind this particular question was, if I can prevent it, I can lower the amount of scraps that I'm dealing with. And I discovered that at various points in my creation process, well, scraps are getting generated along the way. It's not just at the end. It starts first with the amount of yardage that I was purchasing. You see, I used to go to fabric stores and I would be barking out numbers to the person cutting the fabric like I was a stockbroker at the New York Stock Exchange. So I thought about this and asked myself, why am I buying so much excess? Why am I even buying it at all when I don't even have a project in mind? 'Cause it's pretty. And there it was. That was the question that helped me change my spending habit. Currently, I only buy yardage for background fabrics or backing fabrics. Or if I have a specific pattern or project in mind, I usually have the calculated fabric yardage requirement. Otherwise, I'm usually just purchasing, well, fat quarters of fabrics that I like. stockbroker no longer tags along. As I begin cutting into my fabric yards for upcoming projects, well, this is where the strings and crumbs, well, they start to make their appearance, along with larger scrap. You know when you start cutting yards into strips, but you need to straighten up that edge because it was cut off the bolt very crooked? There's your string. And after you cut your strips and you do all the subcuts, you're usually left with that one small scrap piece. There's your crumbs. Whatever is left over after you did all your cuts and subcuts, well, there's your larger scrap. Now I do save the larger scraps and put them in a project bin or bag just to keep as a security net, just in case I sew or cut something wrong. When the project is done, I empty it out and put it in my Quandry basket. Now, as I start sewing and creating the blocks, well, there's the possibility of creating even more crumbs, like when snowballing a corner of a quilt block, or trimming off the excess on a paper piece pattern. Yep, crumb pieces. Now, I know many quilters like to take those cut off triangles after snowballing a corner and immediately turn them into half square triangles and figure out some usage for it later. Sometimes I do that, or I'll take those pieces and sew other crumbs and we'll start a crumb block. When the blocks on the actual project that I'm working on are, well, they're getting complete and I'm starting to put the quilt top together, well, I start thinking of ways of using those scraps or those crumbs and try to incorporate them into the quilt. Like, do I need sashing? Do I have the binding? Can I add cornerstones? What about a border? Or how about creating a matching pillowcase? I try to get as much scraps into the project as possible because I know for a fact that if it makes it into the scrap stash, it's going to be there for a while before it makes it into a quilt top. With this exercise of recognizing how scraps are created, well, it made me realize two things. Number one, not to overbuy. And number two, look for opportunities to incorporate these scraps into the project so that it doesn't make its way into the scrap stash. And there you have it. The 3 questions I answered for myself that helped me create my scrap fabric organization system. I started with the end and worked my way backwards to the beginning, which gave me insights on what I did right and what I was doing wrong. Now, there is something very, very important I must say. This is a process that worked and still works for me. It matched how I think and operate when it comes to quilting and crafting. Now, I'll be the first to admit that following my exact process may or may not work for you when you create your own scrap management system. But at the very least, I hope this gives you food for thought, or perhaps scrap for thought. I truly believe that managing your scrap stash requires a system that is tailored to you. Not just blindly following so-and-so and doing it because that's how they do it. And one last thing, I promise this is the last one. As creators, we evolve. The way we operate today may not necessarily be the same tomorrow. Maybe there's a new technique that we fall in love with, or maybe we discover a different kind of craft that uses fabrics. So as we evolve, the types of scraps we create and use will change. Therefore, your scrap management system should change along with you. Currently, color is my top priority in organizing my scraps, but who knows? Tomorrow I may start selling jelly roll rugs, in which I will need to switch gears and pre-cut everything to a 2.5-inch strip. Every year I ask myself if my scrap management system is still working. If it is, great. If it's not, well, I find out what is different and I run through this whole process again. So give yourself permission to make changes because, well, if it's broke, you need to fix it. I hope that this helps you on your way to creating your own scrap management system. Now, coming up and highly requested, I got some ideas on how to use up those scraps in different ways, so you can look forward to future videos on that. If everything I shared resonated with you and you're interested in getting more scrap project ideas, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the bell for notifications on when I upload the next video. Join the Facebook group or find me on Instagram at Treasure Heart Creations. Well, that's it for now. And until next time, let's all get out there. Let's all create something scrappy.